What Kwasi Kwarteng is planning on doing is trying to cut people's in-work benefits. At the same time, obviously, as we're getting this removal of the working time directive, explicitly so that if you're working part-time, so much so that you cannot pay your bills, you may be a single mother, you may have loads of different dependents, there may be loads of things that you're doing, right? He's going to shrink your budgets, try and force you to work as every hour humanly possible, because whilst also there being a state at which people's actual living expenses are more expensive than they've ever been, right? So he's taking money away from the most vulnerable in society. Shale gas that's taken out by fracking. This is all going to be done by the private sector. And what are they going to do? If it's a private company, they're just going to sell it on the wholesale market, which doesn't change any amount of energy independence whatsoever. It's completely nonsensical. It's, again, they're exploiting the energy crisis to make the people who put the brown envelopes under the table to them as rich as humanly possible. Speaking of criticisms of Liz Truss's future economic plan, obviously we were talking about the planned cut in corporation tax, or Jeremy Corbyn was in that segment that we just watched, and how that he believed that it should be put back up to the amount that it was during the last Labour government when we'd actually had some economic growth, which is 26%. Right now, I've obviously talked about some of Liz Truss's economic plans. This is something that I've discussed, but I will reiterate it here just so everyone understands my position to be able to praise the rest of this segment, I guess, is that we currently have the lowest corporation tax in the G7, and even we had a proposed rise to make it similar to everybody else's. Now we're going to not do that rise anymore to continue being the lowest tax rate in the G7. Now we actually have data on this, which I've brought this up here from Reuters. The low UK corporation tax has failed to boost investment. Reports saying that it lags behind all of the major peers, according to a report on Tuesday, which comes as government prepares to reverse a planned rise. Britain's 19% corporation tax rate, the lowest in the G7, has been due to rise in 2023 under plans announced last year by former Finance Minister Rishi Sunak. However, opposing the rise formed a major part of Liz Truss's successful campaign to defeat Sunak in the contest to succeed Boris Johnson as Conservative Party leader and Britain's Prime Minister. Finance Minister Kwasi Kwarteng is expected to confirm this in an emergency fiscal statement on Friday, where he gives more details about Truss's plan to support the economy in face of surging energy bills. So yeah, as the article says, it's not boosted investment the entirety of this time, right? It's not boosted growth. We've had an incredibly stagnant economy for the last decade. So, the understanding is, right? Mick Lynch went over this on the BBC in a really good segment that he did, an interview on BBC Radio, talking about how if we have higher corporation tax, it incentivizes investment because you get less returns on just extracting money out of the company to then give towards shareholders, right? By putting corporation tax up on your profits, and on things that would end up getting paid out in dividends, it makes it less lucrative to do that. So then they're more likely to put money back into the company so that it doesn't get taxed. It's more efficient use of your money to be able to reinvest it into your company than it is to get it siphoned off by shareholder dividends. If the tax rate on those dividends and on the the profit that was generated would be higher, right? So that's why corporation tax would theoretically boost investment. And as we've seen, this bargain basement corporation tax doesn't lead to any additional economic growth. And the desire and the times in which you've had higher corporation tax in this, especially when they would just be moving up into line with the rest of G7, hasn't led to the kind of capital flight that you'd expect. All the countries that have this higher rate of corporation tax, they don't see huge amounts of capital flight that we've seen that they're telling us will happen if it does get raised to that amount. That capital flight hasn't happened. So this is just basically balmy. But the central tenet of everything that's being put forward by Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss is explicitly so that they can benefit the most amount of rich people at the expense of everybody else, right? And we've seen it in literally every policy. They've said there's going to be tax cuts, and they said, oh, we'll reverse the national insurance rise. Well, that's not a tax cut. That's a U-turn. That's what we call that in the real world. Like, you don't just raise taxes one time and then very, very not short amount of time afterwards, you then U-turn on there. So, look, we've given you this tax cut. Well, you put it up in the fucking first place, mate, right? So it's not a real tax cut that Kwasi Kwarteng is talking about there. The rest of it is all tax cuts that they're doing for either the super rich or just the regularly well-off and wealthy middle-class people, right? Insofar as, for example, we look at the discussion that we were having with regards to the energy sector, insofar as there was no windfall tax, all she did was essentially further increase the deficit, which Tories are supposed to. That those days are long way in the rear view mirror. Like, we're further to the right of Thatcher now, as far as Liz Truss is concerned, at the very least. So instead of a windfall tax to make sure the energy companies who are making huge amounts of money out off of the gas crisis, those profits were entirely protected. We just borrowed loads of money, which would to be able to pay for that, because that's the way that it most benefits the richest people in the world, the petrochemical companies who Liz Truss used to work for. She literally used to be on the board, not the board, she used to work within Shell as a company, which is making huge amounts of money off of the energy crisis, right? One of the other things, speaking of the energy crisis, is that they're going to be bringing back fracking moving forward, to the anger of many actual new local Tory MPs, like lots of villages and places like that would be in range of kind of the shale gas areas that would be used to be able to extract using fracking. These local areas really, really don't want that shit. But again, the reason why they're doing it is not to benefit you, it's not to benefit anybody at home, right? They're making these claims that by expanding shale gas drilling, right, and expanding North Sea oil and gas drilling as well, is to make us independent, right? Now, that is a lie. That's not a thing that's going to happen. It's just completely nonsensical, because all the shale gas that's taken out by fracking, and all of the North Sea gas that gets extracted by expansion into new fields, etc., etc., this is all going to be done by the private sector. This is all going to be done by people who are given private licenses. Maybe the Exchequer will make some money off selling those licenses, or maybe renting out those licenses, but it's hardly a huge amount of money at the end of the day. The lion's share of the money will go to the private company who will be extracting that gas. And what are they going to do? If it's a private company, they're just going to sell it on the wholesale market. That's how they're going to flood the European market with new gas. It's just going to get sold at the current wholesale price or slightly lower, which doesn't change any amount of energy independence whatsoever. It's completely nonsensical. It's, again, they're exploiting the energy crisis to make the people who put the brown envelopes under the table to them as rich as humanly possible, as rich as fucking Croesus, right? By, giving these people licenses to extract shale gas and North Sea gas, they're still going to be able to reap the rewards of the prices that have been essentially protected by the Liz Truss energy plan. So she's capped the prices, made sure the Exchequer is going to pick up the tab for all of these extraction companies to make huge profits out of the North Sea and eventually fracking, apparently, that we're going to be having moving forward, as Energy Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg has told us, right? So that's that. They make huge amounts of profit. We're not going to see any of it. As I've said before, I've said this many times as well. If the North Sea extraction was nationalised, if even the fracking, right? I disagree with fracking for environmental reasons, but if it did happen, if it was a nationalised company that was doing it, just like Equinor does, right? They drill in the Barents Sea and the North Sea. 70% of Norway's oil and gas fields are drilled by Equinor, which has a 67% government stake in it, right? So then if they sell it internally, they get to be able to make sure that the prices that get paid for the end user in Norway are subsidised by the government, because they can set the prices as the majority shareholder of Equinor. Not true in the UK. We all buy from our gas as wholesale, the vast majority from fucking Norway, to be able to fund their sovereign wealth fund that they then use to subsidise the gas for their own citizens. It's a fucking mental plan. Makes no fucking sense, and this will not lead us to an energy independence. It's just a front to be able to divert even more money to the petrochemical industry and the incredibly rich people who, again, the Tory party only exist to serve, right? They only exist to serve these rich people. Now, the next thing that we're going to have that will absolutely drive you crazy. I'm sure people who've active on Twitter have seen these news as well. Is that there's been an attack on workers' rights? Obviously, during the leadership contest, loads of things are floated about curtailing the right of unions to strike. There's an oncoming war between Liz Truss and the unions, which will be incredibly the bloody war, metaphorically. Um, and they're also coming after not just the unions' rights, but also the workers' rights in general. So there's a couple of things that have come to the fore pretty recently. Now, the first thing is that Liz Truss was considering to overhaul the Working Time Directive. Now, what that has at the moment, it means that you have to opt out of working more than 40 hours a week. And if a company hires you, they cannot force you to work more than 40 hours a week unless you waive that right. And they're going to consider scrapping that explicitly so that they can work you to death. We live in an incredibly, casualized economy. People's wages haven't grown; they've been completely stagnant for a decade, and we're in the middle of a biggest cost of living crisis. In some people's memories, at the very least, where people need as much money as possible, and the people that they're attacking in completely unprovoked, right? There's no rationale behind this. Again, all we're going to see is more inflation out of this. We're going to see more as more borrowing happens and more tax cuts happen. All that does is going to increase aggregate demand whilst not increasing productivity. So we're going to see loads of inflation come off the back of this. It's going to be even worse. And people are predicting in opposition parties that she's going to be gone by March as she delivers huge amounts of economic ruination to the country. But I digress. In this perilous situation for the working people in this country, what she's doing, she's attacking the Working Time Directive to make sure that you have to work every single fucking hour of every single living day, right? Workhouse style, sweatshop style, right? What we're also going to get from Kwasi is shrinking the benefit state. So one thing that causes inflation is high employment, right? We have the lowest unemployment in the UK that we've had in 50 years, right? Since Callaghan. Callaghan was the last time that we had unemployment this low, which is when the inflation was an issue previously. That's why Thatcher engaged in managed unemployment to be able to do that. The labour market is incredibly tight, and it's only the lack of union density that means that we're not using that lack of that tight labour market to be able to grow people's wages, because in the casualised working economy it's really difficult to bargain for additional wages because everyone is expendable at this point. And because the cost of living crisis is so high and people are getting everything extracted out of them by all of these incredibly inelastic markets that have all been privatized when they should never have been, so that people can have all of their necessities scalped away from them, whether it be housing, whether it be energy, whether it be food, whether it be utilities, all that kind of malarkey, right? People have they are actually wealth-wise poorer than they've basically ever been in this country, whilst the rich have continued to get richer. As a report has shown, we're one of the least equal countries in Europe, and I think only the US, out of major countries, dwarfs us in levels of inequality. We're essentially just a poor country with a coterie of rich people scalping money out of the top because these industries should never have been privatized in the first place because of the inelastic nature of the markets. But again, story that I've covered plenty of time, right? What Kwasi is planning on doing is trying to cut people's in-work benefits. At the same time, obviously, as we're getting these potential removal of the Working Time Directive, explicitly so that if you're working part-time, so much so that you cannot pay your bills, you may be a single mother, you may have loads of different dependents, there may be loads of things that you're doing, right? He's going to shrink your budgets, try and force you to work as every hour humanly possible, because whilst also there being a state at which people's actual living expenses are more expensive than they've ever been, right? So he's taking money away from the most vulnerable in society, right? We're essentially in the 2010 Redux era, where we're getting not just austerity, right? And the way that there's going to be like a paucity of public services. They claim they're going to solve the NHS crisis, but that's never going to fucking happen, considering the actual things that we're supposed to be using to be able to fund the NHS, like national insurance, are apparently going to get put back down again, which is supposed to be a national insurance levy, to be able to fund the NHS post-COVID. So I have no idea how the fuck that they're going to do that, right? And now, when we've got a tight labour market where they're trying to force people to work more hours and create more aggregate demand overall, essentially meaning that we're going to get even worse inflation. We've got tax cuts increasing aggregate demand. We have this kind of manipulation of the labour market to try and grow labour supply where we already have an incredibly tight labour market. That's going to increase inflation even further, right? What the fuck's going to happen? We're completely fucked. And again, What's happening here? Why are they doing this? Explicitly so that the people who are the richest in this country do not have to pay their fair share. The central tenet of everything that is happening here is to try and benefit the richest people in society. Remember, Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss were both two of the people that wrote this kind of that Britannia Unchained screed, that book that was explicitly there to try and sell anarcho-capitalism to Britain moving forward, right? To try and sell this idea that we should essentially scrap as much of the state as possible, to try and feed into free market orthodoxy, taking away things from like the healthcare industry in Singapore, for example, which is a subscription based service, etc. To take away people's workers' rights, like the Deng reforms did over in China. That's why in that book specifically, Liz Truss talks about the productivity and the working this kind of work ethic of people in China, since they had a load of their workers' rights taken away by the Deng reforms and moving forward, etc., etc. And they don't have a work ethic that quote unquote that you think they do, Liz, because there's some kind of cultural shift in China. It's because they literally have to, otherwise they'll fucking die. Why do you think that there are factories with suicide nets in China, Liz? Why do you think that these things exist? Is it because these people are happy and contented? Like, look at this article here. Benefits Britain has forgotten how to work. Our problems come down to seeing labour as a form of cruelty rather than an ingredient for happiness. If you then put that into this mix of what Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss are talking about, and they want to create this this libertarian dystopia that we have by scrapping people's workers' rights in a kind of Deng reform kind of manner. In which way are you going to have people be more happy by essentially turning us into the sweatshop of Europe, by making us a bargain basement country where venture capitalists and financiers and private equity firms can come in and scalp as much as they can out of the economy, and then they can leave us with the bag, as people have to work stupidly long hours with no money and incredibly expensive services and incredibly expensive necessities. That is not going to create a happier society. And if anything, it just kind of buys into this fucking Protestant work ethic garbage that underpins so much of conservative philosophy. Like, if you engage in, the more labour you do, the kind of the suffering that you engage in, as we were speaking about on stream the other day, this is somehow an edifying thing for you to do. It builds character, almost, right? If this Protestant work ethic of, if you're suffering, that means that you are somehow, by going through these tribulations, it makes you a better person, rather than trying to alleviate that suffering in the first place by creating a better society for all. It is. But the thing is, I don't even think that this is something that conservatives believe. This is something the conservative voter base and probably a large amount of conservative MPs do believe. But do I think this is a thing that Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng believe? Absolutely not. I don't believe these people have any morals or anything like that. They don't have any kind of central you kind of I said moral understanding of any of this, in the same way that the Max Weber Protestant work ethic type people do. I just think that these people just want to fleece the country for all of its worth, and they're doing what they want to do for their corporate paymasters, who they sculpt policy for. They're not doing this because they want to make people happy by engaging in performative fucking labour. They want to do it because they want to make their paymasters rich, and for them to take even more money out of the economy. There's no justification for any of this, right? The other thing that they're planning on doing is cutting stamp duty. Cutting stamp duty for people, for second-time buyers, which essentially is going to continue to inflate the fucking property market by making it an even more lucrative investment lucrative speculative investment for capital, for private equity, for people who do no fucking work, right? They talk about, people like this Matthew Lynn person here, talking about the sanctity of the happiness that you'll get from engaging in some kind of having high level of work ethic right here, right? When they genuinely don't believe in that. This aspirational quote unquote stuff that they're trying to say when you want to create a new entrepreneurs or whatever. This isn't about work. This isn't about engaging in performative labor to make you happy, by setting you free. No one's ever said that before, right? They don't believe in any of that, because they actually think that the best way of making money is to take capital and turn it into more capital, and doing no labour in the first place at all. And it's people like this Matthew Lynn person, that conservative Max Weber mindset that they've got going on here, is the smokescreen that allows absolutely ghouls, as you say, Majima, like Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, to inflict their anarcho-capitalist ideology on the rest of us, and tear apart the fabric of our society. and make life as miserable. I literally think we're going to be seeing people working 60-hour weeks at some regularly. Once you scrap the working time directive, once you scrapped in work benefits, once you've continued to ruin the economy so much so that the rich get richer and richer and richer, and the poor people see none of that, because, as I said, trickle-down economics doesn't work, and as we've seen, the gap between the rich and poor has only gotten bigger as neoliberalism has taken a bigger stranglehold of our economy as a country, right? And we've not seen any growth out of this, right? All of the kind of this quote-unquote low tax, this quote-unquote high investment stuff, that's never fucking happened. That's always been a lie. That's always been the lie of austerity. It's always been a political choice. And it's always been a political choice previously with the benefit reforms that George Osborne, I think he did have that Protestant work ethic mindset. I think he did do that. I don't think he was as far gone down the libertarian new rabbit hole as people like Liz Truss and Kwasi, which is saying something, right? Like, I think that George Osborne is a mass murderer for his austerity politics. I genuinely think that he is, and I think that if you call him anything other than that, you're lying to yourself, right? Or maybe mass manslaughter if you want to be coy about it. I think that for me to tell somebody that I think that they're worse than George Osborne, that is a real insult. As far as I'm saying that I'm saying that you're worse than a mass manslaughterer, as George Osborne is, right? So by taking away stamp duty, all that it's doing is making landlordism as a career path something where you actually do no bloody labour. All you do is you turn capital into more capital. Is going to be this kind of aspirational thing, right? Whereas stamp duty is a way in which that we try and disincentivize this by making sure that more homes are more likely to go to people who are first-time buyers because they don't pay stamp duty. So by removing this, you're essentially taking away that innate bias towards first-time buyers and towards investors, right? First-time investors rather than first-time buyers. Again, they're trying to not just obviously create a society that is fundamentally in favor of the super rich, right? What they're also trying to do is create this quote-unquote aspirational class that they can then somehow coalesce into some kind of voting bloc for them moving forward. The people, just like Thatcher did in the 80s, by selling off a load of public sector assets and using this to be able to, and selling off council houses to create the aspirational generation of the 80s, right? Who then became, the red conservative voters that we have now, the homeowners who are most likely to be able to change from Labour to Conservatives through that public sector sell-off. They're trying to do this through the financial services sector and through all of these benefits to people who don't do any fucking work. That's what they're trying to do now with the policy platform that they're getting here. They're trying to make it easier to be able to exploit workers. So if you want to quote unquote start a small business, and then by not having to work, you rely on the working time directive, by making sure that there's going to be easier to exploit your own workforce to be able to get them to do what you want to do. That feeds into that kind of aspirational class type stuff. But as I've said, does this lead to overall economic growth? No. Does it lead to a happier society? Absolutely not. Does it lead to a more cohesive society? No bloody chance, right? And to put the final nail in the coffin here, right, as well as the kind of ghoulish cut on benefits and cut to the working time directive, if we actually look at the country that we live in, Britain and the US are poor societies with some very rich people. This article by John Byrne Murdoch in the Financial Times. Actually, the FT has been a rare source of actual kind of centrist journalism here. Like, the only people who seem to be taking objective look at the economy of this country, unlike the sycophancy that you get from every other outlet, including the bloody Guardian, right? Polly Toynbee, Labour should be rubbing their hands looking at the economic ruin that Liz Truss is going to do, whereas actual people who I disagree with them politically, but at least like this Byrne Murdoch person, he seems to actually care about the overall effective utility of a policy platform rather than the actual, rather than think tanks, rather than media outlets who just exist to manufacture consent of the people towards making rich people richer at the expense of everybody else, right? Which is surprising. I'm defending the Financial Times here. What world are we living in? Like, last week defending Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. Then today, I'm also saying that George Osborne is better than somebody else, and now also commending the Financial Times. We live in a bizarro world where our society is so screwed that these are the people that I feel like I need to praise. But anyway, where would you rather live? A society where the rich are extraordinarily rich and the poor are very poor, the one where the rich are merely very well off, but even those on the lowest incomes enjoy a decent standard of living. Now, the crux of this as well is, right, there are studies that will show you as well that a society with more equal incomes, like a market economy with more equal incomes, functions better, as people are less likely to want to make economic decisions based on necessity and are more likely to make economic decisions based upon wants rather than need, right? So people are more likely to consume in a manner that most befits their own personal goals rather than just continually consuming necessities. I've talked a load of times about how privatization of these necessary and elastic markets um, is economically ruinous, because it means that people can't consume in the way they want to anymore, because it's really easy to scalp money out of people by having monopoly ownership over natural monopolies, because and things with elastic demand, things you have to have like housing, utilities, etc., etc., you can easily make huge amounts of money because they can't not pay. Like, you can't not pay for a house, you can't not pay your energy bills, you can't not pay any of this, you have to actually pay these things, right? So that means that you can extract as much people as well from people as you want on this, and that's economically ruinous. And people can't consume in a manner that is, I guess, in a way, frivolous. There's no frivolous. People don't have expendable income anymore, or at least the share of people's income that is expendable is much lower than it's ever been because of this privatization of natural monopolies that's gone on over the past 40 years. That's why you see articles like millennials kill XYZ industry, like the yachting industry or whatever, because we don't have any money to consume it, because all our money goes on rent and bills, because the rate at which these have risen is ridiculously high in comparison to everything else, right? That's why it'll irritate you when boomers say, "We have cheap holidays." Yeah, we can't afford it because our rent costs more than a holiday now, right? And this is economically as well as societally toxic, right? Because loads of things, like there was an interesting thing talking about how the recession affected sex workers who lost huge amounts of clients because people didn't have expendable income to be able to spend on something that is technically just a frivolous experience as far as they're concerned, right? It's not something that you have any necessity for, paying you for the service of a sex worker. So during the recession and the financial crisis post 2008 and within the 2010s, sex workers didn't get very much work at all, and led to horrendous working conditions that they had to go through to be able to make whatever money that they could. So that is why a more equal economy with a market economy is much more economically prosperous, because people can make decisions based upon what they want to rather than they need to, allowing more businesses of those kind of manners to be able to thrive within that economy. Rather than what's happening now, we have private financial institutions who own these huge natural monopolies that they need to continue siphoning money off. Like, I was talking in another video as well previously about the rolling stock leasing companies who own the trains, are owned by private equity firms in Australia, Hong Kong, Germany, and they don't do anything. They don't make any value. They're not productive. They just own stuff, and then people have to pay rent on that stuff, and that just gets siphoned out of the country, right? We always talk about things like Brexit was always supposed to be done on giving us personal sovereignty. So essentially, what people were looking for, really, when they're talking about this, is economic protectionism. We don't have any of that. All we've done is become the bargain basement sweatshop UK, where financial institutions from around the world can come and take money out of us, and then never put it back into the economy. And again, that's another reason why we don't have very high growth in this country, because it all just gets shipped off overseas, and that's going to continue to happen, especially in the financial services rather than the manufacturing industries, which are all leaving because they need to be able to trade in and outside of the European Union, which we don't get anymore because of Brexit, and live in the single market. So it's really economically ruinous what's being engaged in right here. Anyway, let's continue. But for all but the most ardent free market libertarians, the answer would be the latter. Research has consistently shown that while most people express a desire for some distance between top and bottom, they would rather live in a considerably more equal society than they do at present. Many would even opt for a more egalitarian society if the overall pie was smaller than the less equal one, which I would also agree with. But that's also not you can have the cake and eat it, right? Or the pie, I guess in this case, and eat it. And you can have this equal society and also it be prosperous, because you are more prosperous the more equal you are a lot of the time. Look at Norway, Sweden, Denmark, right? The generous welfare states they have led to strong economies, in the same way that the sovereign wealth fund that's generated because of the gas and oil industry that we are talking about earlier as well from Equinor, in Norway specifically, right? It follows that one good way to evaluate which countries are better places to live than others is to ask, is life good for everyone there, or is it only good for rich people? To find the answer, we look at how people at different points in income distribution compare to their peers elsewhere. If you're a proud British or American, you may want to look away now. Starting at the top of the ladder, Britons enjoy very high standards of living virtually by any benchmark. Last year, the top earning 3% of the UK households each took home but 84k after tax. Like Mr. Top 50% from Question Time, we all remember him. He He takes up far too much of my brain space, but I digress. The equivalent $225k after adjusting for price differences between countries. This puts Britain's highest earners narrowly behind the wealthiest Germans and Norwegians and comfortably among the global elites. So what happens when we move down the rungs? For Norway, it's a consistently rosy picture, and they have a stronger economy than we do, as I've said. The top 10% rank second for living standards among the top deciles in all countries. The median Norwegian household ranks second amongst all national averages, and all the way down at the other end. Norway's poorest 5% are the most prosperous bottom 5% in the world. Right? In the world. And we pay for that. We're paying for their prosperity because we have to spend huge amounts of money buying gas from the state-owned enterprise of Equinor that's extracted from the North Sea. They also extract from our area of the North Sea as well, because part of the private licenses to drill in our North Sea has been sold to the Norwegian government essentially at this point. So we pay for their sovereign wealth fund with our money. We even buy electricity from the hydroelectric plants in Norway with undersea cables that feed us electricity through the North Sea as well. So even more money, more of our money is going to fund the prosperous working class of Norway. In Britain, it's a different story. While the top earners rank 5th, the average household ranks 12th, and the poorest 5% rank 15th. Far from simply losing touch with their Western European peers, last year the lowest earning bracket of British households had a standard of living that was 20% weaker than their counterparts in Slovenia, the grand former Yugoslav state of Slovenia. We stand Slavoj Žižek. And in the middle, it's a similar story. In 2007, the average UK household was 8% worse off than its peers in northwestern Europe, while that deficit has since ballooned to a record 20%. Fucking hell. On present trends, the average Slovenian household will be better off than its British counterpart by 2024, and the average Polish family will move ahead before the end of the decade. A country in desperate need of migrant labour may soon have to ask new arrivals to take a pay cut rather than a pay rise, which is the reason which was driving a lot of immigration previously. And across the Atlantic, it is the same story as well. To be clear, the US data show that both broad-based growth and the equal distribution of the proceeds matter for well-being. 5 years of healthy pre-pandemic growth in US living standards across the distribution lifted all boats, a trend that was conspicuously absent in the UK. Like, we're literally less equal than the United States at this point, right? I mean, we look at, like, the out-of-pocket healthcare costs being paid by the UK, like, they're almost as high as the US now because of what the Tories have done to the NHS. Like, I have to pay for private healthcare. Like, do you think I grew these tits on the NHS? No, mate. I had to pay for them by going private with my HRT. Redistributing the gains more evenly would have a far more transformative impact on quality of life for millions. The growth spurt boosted incomes of the bottom decile of US households by roughly an extra 10%. But transposed Norway's inequality gradient on the US, and the poorest decile Americans would be a further 40% better off, while the top decile would remain richer in the top of almost every other country on the planet. Kevin Logan with the raid of 53. Welcome to the Injustice stream, everybody. Hope everyone's doing well. Make sure you click my face down there to be on the stream, or just press F5. Thank you very much for the follow, Radio Yerevan. Welcome to the Justice stream. If you're new here, please do follow. I would appreciate it. And we're talking about the fact that the UK and US are absolutely screwed economically wise. Equality rise. Hey, Wayward Historian with a subscription. Welcome to the Justice stream. Likewise, the Story Girl as well. Welcome. Essentially, we're incredibly, and Cornbread as well. Thank you. Welcome to the Justice stream. Where the economic equality in the UK is currently worse than it is in Slovenia. So we're going through this article from someone in the Financial Times. Ethics Dave, Belvoir P. Thank you very much for the follows. Welcome to the Injustice stream. Hope you are doing well. I mean, the US, the poorest decile in the US is doing better than it is in the UK, which we found out from this article, right? The UK is uniquely unequal compared to its European and US counterparts. Well, the Pork Markets emote is really good. And if you're watching this in the future on YouTube, you can get the Pork Markets emote by becoming a YouTube member. So that's one for the segment later on. Pork Markets indeed, main captain. Welcome. Did you have a good stream, Mr. Logan? And Wave Historians gifted a sub to Mr. Logan as well. So you have access to all of my excellent emotes. Thank you very much for the gifted sub. It is much appreciated. Our leaders are, of course, right to target economic growth, but to wave away concerns about the distribution of a decent standard of living, which is what income inequality essentially measures, is to be uninterested in the lives of millions. And as I said, it is economically toxic to have your consumer class, right? We live in consumer capitalism, and the people at the bottom rung, the working class, are the people who use the most amount of their income to engage in consumption, and they currently cannot consume because A, so much of their income is being taken up by necessities because they're being scalped by private equity firms, and second of all, is because by them not having enough slice of the pie because there's no redistributive economics, they can't consume, into elective sectors of the economy, which would lead to further economic activity and further our GDP and make our economy larger. Again, this is why you have to engage in immigration, right? So why this fight against immigration is nonsensical, because in a consumer capitalist economy, population growth is a really easy way to grow your GDP, right? They don't really they haven't impacted um people's standards of living, or people's overall incomes. They don't actually undercut us in the way that people think they do. Excellent Loner Box video on that, well worth watching, about how immigrants don't depress wages of the native population. Um, they also, because basically what the long and short of it is that by moving to the country and getting a job, you are then also both working and getting a job, but you're also a consumer, right? The number of jobs is not based upon, it's not just a fixed number. That's not a closed system. The number of jobs is essentially related to the size of the economy, and by having an extra consumer, that's another person that can be sold stuff to by a future company. So overall, as the population expands, the economy expands, which means that more jobs are available overall, right? So that's the long and short of why immigration is absolutely fine and doesn't actually undercut people. Remember, 10 years ago, the Tories were cutting the public sector to cut the debt. Now, in 2022, they've raised the debt to record levels so they can cut taxes for the rich. Yeah, not engaging into windfall tax to then further increasing public debt. It's a really weird thing where we essentially have kind of klepto neoliberalism, right? Where it's not about using the state to be able to maintain competition. It's about using the state to give people what they expect from the state, right? People aren't actually people. I'll let everyone in on a secret, right? This country's not full of neoliberals. This country is full of social democrats mostly, right? When you poll them on economic matters, they like public ownership. They like redistributive economic policies. They actually like this kind of stuff, right? Um, and our government has to somehow marry the fact that they want to make sure that they prioritize the needs of the super rich by borrowing huge amounts of money and then using it to be able to siphon into the petrochemical industry, which they're now doing, as I mentioned previously, with fracking, as they're doing with, by subsidizing, the North Sea gas extractors through borrowing from the exchequer, right? They also have to balance that with the fact that people in this country expect the state to do more than just to maintain competition, right? We expect money for the NHS, we expect money for schools, we expect public services, right? And that doesn't gel economically with the neoliberal paradigm that they actually want to push in the abstract. So whilst they're actually selling off people, places in the public sector, whilst they are trying to take funds away from these public services and trying to cut taxes on the wealthy, on the middle class, etc., etc., the exchequer gets less and less money from revenue from state-owned enterprises and from taxes, right? So, but then they can't expect to win elections off the back of making everyone's public services suck. So they've been forced to borrow more money, as Kieran has rightly pointed out there. So they are walking a really thin line between their own economic orthodoxy and the expectation of the public that can allow them to win an election. This understanding that they're somehow going to be economically prudent, even though they haven't been, right? But to be fair, there's nothing wrong with public sector debt. Really isn't anything wrong with borrowing money, as long as using it to invest in infrastructure. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is this money is just being siphoned up into the pockets of the richest people in the country, right? So, for example, there's a really, really good example of this, and that is the ways in which housing benefit works, right? So to go back, 40 years or whatever, we look at the council house sell-off because of right to buy. These were previously council houses that were used to subsidize people who couldn't really afford to be able to, rent from the private sector in the first place. So the council houses would have had subsidized rent for these people, but then obviously when they were sold off and this essentially this revenue generator for the state, right? The state maintained the asset of the council house, or I guess the local council did, but that essentially is the state as far as I'm concerned. Would then be able to generate revenue, even though it's not huge amounts of revenue because it was subsidized rents, they would still be able to generate some amount of revenue whilst maintaining the asset as well. Essentially becoming the same way that a landlord uses capital to be able to generate more capital without being productive. But if the state does it, they can then spend that money to be able to do better public services and be able to expand the housing, etc., 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 in a way that is sustainable and affordable for the people on the bottom rung of the ladder. But now that we've massively shrunk the size of the social housing sector in the UK because of Right to Buy and because of the council housing sell-off, and the fact that we never built any, neither under Major nor Blair, nor Cameron nor May, although we did build a few council houses under Boris Johnson, because this hasn't risen to meet the demand. It's only in 2011, may I remind everybody, that private rents overtook social rents as the majority of rental accommodation in this country. This financialization of housing as a commodity, as we've seen, has allowed house prices to rise because of the electoral block of council house recipients from Right to Buy that have then been pandered to by Conservative and then Labour and then Conservative governments successively because they needed to rely on this big block of voters to win elections. That's continued to inflate the price of housing, which, as the price of housing has been inflated, which will continue to inflate because of the stamp duty cut that Liz Truss is proposing now to benefit, rich people in general, but homeowners at the very least, right? Who are rich in comparison to the vast majority of people in this country. The rents have risen so much so that they're now unaffordable for huge amounts of people. So what we do now is that the Exchequer has to pay out money in housing benefit to people to pay extortionate rents they otherwise couldn't have afforded because the market hasn't corrected, because there's no need for the market to correct, because the demand is completely inelastic. People need a place to live. So the market does not need to ever correct because the demand can't really change, right? The demand on the supply, whereas the supply is reasonably inelastic but can be changed. The demand is fixed based upon the population. So much so that the price hasn't gone down, but people can't be homeless, and the government's got essentially a social contract role to deal with the homelessness epidemic, right? What they now do is the Exchequer has to pay out money in housing benefit, huge amounts of money, right? Rather than owning the asset and being able to subsidise people's rents through council housing and through housing associations, now what we have instead is paying out huge amounts of money in housing benefit for houses that are more expensive than they should be because they've marketised a natural monopoly. That money then gets put into the hands of private landlords that they put back into the housing sector to invest further inflating the market, further making the rents higher than people can't further afford, so the Exchequer has to spend more money in housing benefit. Whereas they previously owned the asset and were able to use that for a profit, we're now spending huge amounts of money just essentially propping up the business model of private landlords. Which is, again, it's klepto-neoliberalism. The Exchequer's having to borrow more money, right? Because they're not raising taxes, they're not raising capital gains tax, for example, and we're not getting the corporation tax rise, again, that we were promised, then the Exchequer's not going to have enough money to be able to then actually go back and have the money to pay out of this housing benefit, which is only going to be paid off more and more and more and more as house prices continue to inflate. Because of the nature of this market, they have to continue to inflate, because you cannot risk your voter base going into negative equity lest you lose the next election. So this cyclical system makes no bloody sense, and is continuing further Tory economic policy that will never ever bring down the deficit because people expect the state to pick up the tab, just like they're doing with the energy crisis, just like they're doing with the housing crisis, and just like they will do with every crisis to come, right? But they do not believe in wealth taxes and increasing taxes and state-owned enterprises because they're all neoliberals. So we're in the worst of both worlds, where we can't have a larger state or a larger set of state-owned enterprises or a larger taxable income because they don't want it, but the state also provides a bunch of things that the people of the country, absolutely expect. So we just have to continue inflating the deficit from the supposedly financially prudent party of the two, right? Tony Blair may have been a shit, and Gordon Brown may have been a bad economic manager, but at least they knew basic stuff like this. They couldn't just rely on continued borrowing. I would prefer they did engage in PFIs to fund public services at that time. They did at least try and raise taxes, like we had the 50p in the pound at one point during the Labour administration, where they did engage in some level of tax increases. outside of PFIs, but I digress. Whereas the Conservatives, they just have a completely unsustainable economic model that will never actually work. Yeah, another stamp duty cut. Like, it's not even like just getting rid of stamp duty. I think it's for anybody with a net worth under £1 million. They no longer have to pay stamp duty. That's Liz Truss's plan. It's absolutely demented. Something better change in a positive way before I die, otherwise I'll be very upset. When Thatcher came in, I said it was a bad idea with a short-term benefit, and I was only young then. And the thing is, right, I've said this previously as well, is that at least Thatcher was trying to fix something, right? She saw a broken economy and said, well, let's do something to fix it. She went too far, what she did was bad, right? She's not a good economic leader, and she didn't do good things, she did loads of bad things, right? But at least she had a point to what she was doing. Whereas Liz Truss and Boris Johnson and David Cameron and Theresa May, they've seen 40 years of neoliberalism, they've seen it fail, but they're so dogmatically tied to it, they're so ideologically committed to this kind of running the country into the ground, they just can't stop. There's no brakes on the neoliberalism train as far as they're concerned. So they're going to continue making the country work based on blind ideology with no pragmatic understanding of how any of this shit works. Because they refuse to turn away from this kind of dogmatic orthodoxy. There's no rhyme or reason to it. There is some rhyme or reason to it, and it is they will continue getting money from their donors if they do what their donors want. Which, as I've said from the whole of this segment, is to make sure the rich get as rich as possible, and that's it. That's their only policy, is making rich people rich. Nothing good is going to come out of any of this. And we're just going to become, with the erosion of workers' rights, the erosion of trade union rights, the erosion of the working time directive, cutting people's benefits even further, despite the fact that the labour market is incredibly tight right now. It's nonsensical. It's completely nonsensical. Yeah, they're just a bunch of ideologists, and we're going to be the sweatshop of Europe at this point. Like, how long? At what point are we going to end up like Bangladesh, where we just have essentially? Well, we have a monarchy already. So we're basically all serfs, right? At this point, to be honest, subjects of the Queen. Like, what point are we going to be actual literal serfs? Where at least there's a funny meme that was going around where at least back in feudal times, you had access to the common lands. You only paid 1/10 of your income to the lord. And you owned your own home. Now you have to pay rent to a land. You pay half your rent to the landlord. You don't own your own home, and there's no commons anymore because it's all been bloody privatized, right? 40 years later, media talk about trickle down economics like it's a new thing. It's absolute nonsense. Like the idea that trickle down economics, quote unquote, hasn't been the majoritarian economic policy of every single government since Thatcher, both Labour and Conservative alike, right? People refuse to criticise Blair in the same way. Like, it was better. We didn't fix the problems, right? You put a PI-shaped sticking plaster over the top of all the problems of neoliberalism, and then all these problems are now coming home to roost, right? But yeah, I'm very scared for the future of this country. Very, very worrisome. Which doesn't really bear thinking about. Also, future YouTube viewers, if you enjoyed this segment, which I will upload to YouTube after the stream, you can like, comment, and subscribe. If you click the bell, it'll notify you when I go live, and you also become a member on YouTube for 99p to get access to the wonderful chat emotes that you'll have seen down that side and then sometimes down that side, depending on where the chat is, from people on Twitch, because YouTube people get the same emotes, but for cheaper. So thanks to everyone who subscribed on Twitch during the stream, yeah. But with regards to YouTube viewers in future, I will see you on the next segment.